This video is sponsored by Snot Goblin Gaming.
We get a lot of really cool hobby products coming across our desk from all sorts of companies. And even though the channel is growing pretty rapidly, we're still not at the size where we have to sell our souls for sponsors. Which means I can pick and choose the products that we make content on. So when I saw Snot Goblin Gaming's post about their future-proof terrain, I reached out and they were awesome enough to send us a factory sample.
Before we get into painting, let's have a look and see what the Snot Goblin Gaming's team have come up with this future-proof modular terrain system. Honestly, when this turned up, I spent probably an hour and a half, nearly 2 hours, just playing with it and making different shapes, different buildings, and honestly, even as a factory sample, this stuff is incredible. I made compounds and towers and ruins, and even the detail is absolutely amazing. Let's get stuck into what we do around here, and we'll kick it off with some primer. I'm priming from black because I just want that coverage and that opacity. But really, I just want something that our paint can stick to. The biggest component of this video, and what I'm going to be doing with this terrain, is basically wet blending. Now, if you haven't wet blended before, it's a really simple idea of taking two different paints and mixing them together on the model while they're wet, and they'll create their own blends and gradients as you go through. We're not going for realism in this video, we're going for something a little bit more fun with a little bit more saturation. So I've picked out blue, magenta, and a turquoise. And that's really going to help to give us one, some visual interest, and two, kind of a Scooby-Doo haunted mansion vibe. Usually we're talking about thinning down paints around about here, but I find with wet blending, you want it just that little bit thicker. Don't get me wrong, my brush was still damp, so these still aren't straight out of the pot, but you do want that thickness, that creamy consistency to kind of help everything blend together, and it will smooth out as you work the paint and you push it back and forward. If you've never wet blended before, something like this is a fantastic chance to get used to it and try something new without having to worry about small fine details. Big open sections like all of these tiles and bricks down here on the floor of our terrain is the perfect example and the perfect chance to go out and try this technique. The other thing to remember here is brush size. Now I'm using a bigger brush because it's a big piece. It's that simple. Different tools for different jobs, and when you're painting something big, you use a big brush. Speaking of different tools for different jobs, we're going to move into dry brushing. Now, I like to put a little bit of water on my hand and let the dry brush kind of soak it up just that little bit. That's going to actually help smooth out the paint. If you ever get that dry, chalky, dusty look from dry brushing, it's because there's no moisture left in there. Using paper towel usually sucks the moisture out, and that's what gives us that texture. A little bit of water is going to really help smooth out that process and give us a better looking finish. Now I'm going to pull out some AK Interactive Wargame washes and just give it a pretty thick coat. Now I did use the airbrush for the rest of this, so it's not a big deal if you want to brush it on or if you want to airbrush it. And you can also use oil paints, because I'm going to come back now with some thinners and kind of aim for the middle of the stones or the tiles and kind of wipe them away. And I'm just using a makeup sponge here. This is something you can really go to town on. You can leave as much on as you want, or you can remove as much as you want. Personally, I'm only removing more of the wash from the center, so we have that big bright poppy color. And now we get to pull out one of the best kept secrets in weathering: kids' watercolors. With just a touch of water, you activate these things, and that's really good to remember in the future, because that's also how we're going to clean it up. Now, you can add as much or as little water in this as you want, and you can be as neat or as messy as you want. Now, remember, the messier that you get with this, you will get a very matte, dry, dusty surface, which is great for weathering. Or, like I'm doing here, you can concentrate a little closer to the recesses, and this is what's going to be our grout. I'm just putting dabs of white and green in there just to give some variation and to make it look a little bit more natural. And honestly, it is just a little bit of fun watching the capillary action. When it's dry, if you have made a little bit of a mess, go back with a wet brush and just rub it off. It reactivates with water, which means we can go back in with our wet paintbrush, give it a bit of a swirl, and then soak it all up and take off all that paint. This is one of the easiest way to get a really clean finish on grout and tiles. For the frame detail, I'm just picking everything out gold because we really want that Scooby-Doo vibe, and the warm bright gold here really pops against all of our cool dark colors. A little bit of a bright silver just to pick out the blades and other details like the hinges and the shutter handles, and that's basically everything. A massive thank you to Snot Goblin Gaming for sponsoring this video, and if you jump down into our description, you will find a link to the Kickstarter that launches February 20. You can reserve your spot for just $1 and save up to $100 off this full set. Big love to all our prismatic heretics out there, and we'll see you next Tuesday.